Well, that means that James Comey is head of the FBI. When this alert came out that the Russians had hacked into the DNC, number one, refused to look at the DNC computers, and number two, took the word of a very suspect, a cyber firm of very ill repute, and it took their word without a final report. Comey didn't demand a final report. He just took what Crowdstrike said. Yep, with the Russians. So, I mean, you don't have to be an inspector general to see that the whole thing falls apart.
Hey everybody, welcome to another exciting edition of Primo Nutmeg. On today's show, Ray McGovern is back. Ray, of course, is a former CIA analyst and the former head of the CIA's Soviet Foreign Policy Branch. We're going to talk about last week's events in Iran. Ray is going to give a little bit of context on the geopolitics of the Middle East. Then we're also going to spend a good deal of time talking about RussiaGate, and Ray is also going to share his perspective on Julian Assange and Tulsi Gabbard. Folks, this is a great interview with lots of awesome content. I don't think you're going to be disappointed. We go for over an hour and a half. And although this is already a jam-packed episode of Primo Nutmeg, I also wanted to spend a minute just talking about the Democratic debates that have happened the last two nights. Now, on the next episode of the show, we're actually going to spend some time reviewing the debates with Nick Gillespie of Reason magazine. He's going to share his libertarian perspective on the debates. That episode should be coming out on the 4th of July. But before that, I did just want to briefly share my thoughts on the debate. Before these debates, I have to admit that I didn't really get the appeal of candidates like Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Cory Booker, or Elizabeth Warren. But after seeing their performance over the last two nights, I have to admit that these four candidates did really well. I know that they were given preferential treatment. I know that they were given more time and more flexibility by the moderators. But that being said, I do have to say that each of these candidates did stay on topic. They were logical. Kamala Harris especially did a great job speaking, and you can't really say the same for Beto O'Rourke, who I thought had a terrible showing. He seemed completely lost, he seemed completely out of his element, and although I know it's still early, I think that this is just another example of why his campaign is really going nowhere. He's going to be stuck at the roughly 5% of the vote that he's at, and I don't see him gaining on any of the other candidates. I think that he's been sort of propped up by the media as the future of the neoliberal wing of the party. But when you actually stop and listen to him, everything he says is really just incoherent. He doesn't really have a point. It's all just sort of random feel-good lines that don't really mean anything. Joe Biden, I also thought, did not do too well, especially when Kamala Harris was going after him. But that being said, I don't really know if it's going to matter given his name recognition. Maybe he'll lose a few votes to Harris or Booker or Warren, but I don't think that this was enough to really knock him out of first place. Now, of course, my regular listeners know that I really was rooting for Tulsi Gabbard as well as Bernie Sanders. I thought that both of them did a good job, especially on delivering a peace message. It was great to get at least a couple of doves up there when everyone else was ranting about China and Russia and North Korea. That being said, I don't think that either of them really won their respective debates. I thought that both slipped up, at least early on. There was one question in particular where Bernie Sanders was asked about socialism and he just started going after Trump. He really did not address the issue at all. I thought that it was a good opportunity for him that he totally missed. Likewise, Tulsi didn't really seem as poised and comfortable as she normally does. She seemed slightly flustered, she misspoke a couple of times, and overall I think it might have just been a missed opportunity for both candidates. Now, someone who I was really disappointed with in these debates was Andrew Yang. While I think that most of us know who Andrew Yang is and about his UBI policy, I didn't know that he was a RussiaGator. I didn't know that he was one of these people who believed that Russia, quote unquote, hacked our democracy. And I think that he probably lost some support with that statement last night. Likewise, although Marianne Williamson was really delivering a sound message and everything that she said was correct, she also seemed somewhat nervous and kind of lost. It seemed like when she was asked a question, she didn't really know who to address the answer to. And it was really just sort of hard to follow what her overall argument was. Kirsten Gillibrand reminded me a little bit of Reese Witherspoon's character from the movie Election. But overall, I don't think that many of the other candidates really stood out, at least not enough to make a difference. Jay Inslee, for example, I think did a pretty good job, but given that there's 25 candidates in the race, I just don't see there being enough room for these other milquetoast candidates to really make any kind of progress. Anyway, folks, that's my brief summary of the debates. Again, Nick Gillespie from Reason magazine will be joining me for a special 4th of July edition of Primo Nutmeg. where we're going to review these debates. So please do stay on the lookout for that. Again, folks, please remember, as always, that you can help support the show by going to patreon.com/PrimoNutmeg. There, for only $1 a month, not only can you help support the show, but you can also get access to hours and hours of content from the earlier seasons. Again, it's only $1 a month. You can give more if you'd like, but $1 is the minimum. And again, your support will really help keep this show going and will help me continue to bring you more great interviews like this one. So now, folks, without any further ado, here's my interview with Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern, welcome back to Primo Nutmeg.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for being back on the show. It's kind of funny, the first time that you were on was the day after Trump first bombed Syria, and today we woke up to the news that Trump had ordered an attack on Iran but called it off at the last minute. I definitely want to get into all of the issues with Iran. I'd like to talk about Julian Assange. I definitely want to talk a lot about RussiaGate. For those who do not know who you are, could you explain what your expertise is in regards to Russia?
Sure. I had the odd decision in college to major in Russian because I loved the language. I took a graduate degree in Russian studies. Before the Army called me in active duty as a first lieutenant, where I did my active duty for 2 years, and then I was seconded, or actually transferred to the CIA, become the principal analyst on Soviet foreign policy toward China and the Far East, including Vietnam. A couple years later, I was made chief of that branch, the Soviet foreign policy branch at CIA. I did a couple of overseas tours, one in Moscow. I did a tour as the assistant or Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Western Europe. And my career pretty much was fulfilled when I worked on the President's Daily Brief for the third time, actually. By coincidence, I was at the point of my career where Nixon and Ford, I was working on the PDB then. And then when Reagan came into town, I was one of the privileged few who was able to go down and brief the highest officials of our government. Every other morning, we worked in teams. So I was not only a preparer and editor of the President's Daily Brief, but I briefed it one-on-one to any assortment of people who happened to be in town. Vice President Bush, Secretary of State Schultz, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, a whole assortment of assistants to the President for National Security Affairs, some of whom ended up in jail. And then we asked the President if it'd be okay if we also gave similar briefings to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At that point, it was General Vesey, and he approved that. We also briefed Reagan, of course, but only when he was up that early. So it was incredible duty, and it was nice to end my career with that kind of responsibilities.
And since you retired from the CIA, you've been working with an organization called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. You were one of the groups who actually warned that Iraq did not possess weapons of mass destruction.
It was really pretty easy. We were, like everyone else, horrified at the performance of the mainstream media, but we had enough contacts within the government, and we also had enough familiarity with the evidence to be convinced that, number one, there was no need for a war in Iraq. Number two, that the weapons of mass destruction claims were bogus. The UN inspectors having verified that those weapons had been destroyed way back in the late 90s. And, the business of connecting Al-Qaeda with Saddam Hussein, well, that was the worst. What was really bad was that when we attacked Iraq on the 20th or whatever it was, 21st of March 2003, 69% of the American people believed not only that Saddam Hussein had all manner of weapons of mass destruction, but also that he played some kind of role in 9/11. That was a masterstroke by our mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, and the lead. None of it was true. But, I'll jump ahead now and simply say that I haven't seen the latest polls. My guess is that at least 69% of the American people believed that Russia interfered in our election by hacking into the Democratic National Committee computers and giving them to WikiLeaks. We know now that that's bogus. We proved that 2 years ago. Now we have the Department of Justice, no less, pulling the rug out of the former FBI Director James Comey, saying that the evidence that he relied upon to charge Russia with this hacking was ephemeral, was not even given to him in final form by this Democratic National Committee client, CrowdStrike. So all this stuff is very consequential. If I have one frustration to voice, it is the fact that none of my colleagues and veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity or I are allowed into the mainstream media to pursue our analytic work and tell about our conclusions.
Well, I mean, it is interesting just if you look at the perception that they've been able to push versus the facts, right? I mean, because even after the Mueller report, I mean, I think if nothing else, the Mueller report really did disprove that Donald Trump was colluding with the Kremlin. But there's actually been polling that's shown that the percentage of people who think that he did collude has gone up since the report was released. So it's amazing how the corporate media can really manipulate what people believe. So, I mean, I really do want to dig into RussiaGate. However, I feel inclined, just because of what's happened this past week, to maybe start off with what's happened in the Gulf of Oman. So last week we had the accusation that mines had exploded on tankers in the Gulf of Oman. And that really didn't seem to be well received. Not many people seem to be buying it. I was actually fascinated. I saw Bernie Sanders on a corporate media network on MSNBC saying that he was skeptical about it, and he was comparing it to Iraqi WMD and also the Gulf of Tonkin before the Vietnam War.
If you're the commander-in-chief, Bernie Sanders, you're President Sanders, what do you do right now where Iran is arguably acting aggressively, even if it's in reaction to the U.S. policymaking?
Well, first of all, just a couple of points, Andrea. First of all, what is absolutely necessary is an objective investigation as to these incidents. The destruction or the bombing or the attacking of oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman is not acceptable, and we need to investigate it. Second of all,
you don't accept what the Secretary, let me just ask, you don't accept the declaration from the Secretary of State?
No, I don't. I mean, there needs to be an objective investigation. As you know, the Japanese in fact, the owner of the tanker that was attacked disagrees with Trump. But here's the main point that I want to make. If you look at the recent history of this country, I think we understand that the two worst foreign policy disasters were based on lies that came from the White House. You remember the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident that led us to increase military involvement in Vietnam. And man, I could speak, that was my generation. 59,000 brave young men never came home from that war, and tens of thousands of more died, committed suicide, got into drugs when they came home. That was based on a lie. And then you look more recently at the war in Iraq, which I vigorously opposed because I did not believe Cheney, and I did not believe John Bolton, and I did not believe the Bush administration. Again, based on a lie that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Let me just say this. I will do everything that I personally can as a United States Senator to stop the United States attacking Iran. If we go into a war with Iran, this will be an asymmetrical war which will go on and on and on. There will be never-ending wars in the Middle East. It'll make the war in Iraq look like a cakewalk. So we have got to do everything we can to bring the antagonist, Saudi Arabia, which is a brutal dictatorship, together with Iran. Bring them together, use the power of the United States to work out a diplomatic solution, not a military solution.
And then also just, yesterday we had this drone that was shot down, and it's being disputed if it was over Iranian airspace or international waters. So I know that this is all kind of breaking news now as we're recording this, but I just was wondering if maybe you have any overall thoughts on what's happening with Iran and, these two back-to-back instances that seem to be kind of an excuse for ramping up tensions with Iran.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I chuckled because up until 2 minutes before we went on this program, I was helping compose a Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity memorandum to the president on this whole matter. And I won't steal our thunder here, but I will mention that we point out to the president that he's got to be really careful about whom he believes here. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and Bolton, the anti-Iran advisor to the President for National Security Affairs, have been drumming war for months. And they've even sort of preemptively said, when Iran attacks any of our ships, we're going to retaliate. Well, hello. The smart money says these were pretexts for war. They were false flag attacks. There's also a possibility that Iran is just up to here with what's going on and wants to demonstrate the vulnerability of that sea passage, the Strait of Hormuz. But in any case, it's the Trump administration, driven by Pompeo and by Bolton, that is responsible for all this. I mean, they left the deal. They got out of the joint agreement, the Iran deal, what they call the nuclear deal, which prevented Iran from developing any nuclear weapon for, I think it was 10 years. Well, why did they leave that deal? Well, maybe this is the time to say this right up front. You can't understand U.S. policy toward the Middle East, toward Iraq, toward Syria, toward Iran, without realizing that it's formed at least equally by the country of Israel as it is by the people in the United States that are very sensitive to the political repercussions of seeming to oppose the country of Israel. Now, Syria, Iraq, Iran, are they a threat to the United States? No way. No way. We know what happened in Iraq. Has Iran started a war in the last couple of centuries? No, it hasn't. Has it been invaded? Yes, it has. By whom? By Iraq. With what support? With the full support of the American military establishment. People don't know that, okay? So, cui bono? To whose benefit would an attack on Iran be? Well, if it's by the United States, that would be a terrific boon to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab UAE, Emirates, and it would just sort of solidify the U.S. in support of those countries. You don't have to take my word for it. Let me give you, in the Bronx we say, I'll give you a for instance. Here's a for instance. Back in the time when there was the attack in Ghouta outside of Damascus, 2013, blamed on Syrian President Assad, but we know better now it was actually the rebels. President Obama was sorely tempted to retaliate. Before he decided to back off, and he's very proud of that, by the way, the situation was very volatile. And there's a woman named Jody Ruderman, who was the bureau chief of the New York Times in Jerusalem at that time. Now, she was kind of new, a little wet behind the ears. She had worked on other things, but she was the bureau chief. And so, to her credit, she went and talked with Israeli leaders. And, the New York Times bureau chief has immediate access to Israeli leaders. She talked to all manner of them, including retired officials, like the former head of the former consul general in New York. And she asked them, she said, now look, Syria is a real problem. It looked like we might get directly involved in Syria. What's your preferred outcome? And they said, well, Jody, this is really doesn't sound so good. Doesn't sound very humanitarian. But our preferred outcome is no outcome. She says, we say, s'il vous plaît. What do you mean, no outcome? And then the consul general, Alon Pincus, former New York. He said, look, Jody, we see it as a sort of a playoff game where you don't want either team to win and you don't want either team to lose. As long as Shia and Sunni are engaged in this bloody, bloody war with each other, not only in Syria, but throughout the whole area, we'd prefer that they bleed to death. Israel has nothing to fear from Syria, period. End quote. Now, there was a miracle. It was early September. And I know, as a New Yorker, that what we used to call the high mokri moks, they go out to the Hamptons to celebrate Labor Day, and they usually stay an extra week. And so when Jody, to her credit, filed that report, there were people not the first string betting what could be said in the New York Times. Guess what? On the 6th of September, 2013, her full report appeared as the lead in the New York Times. Now, it's the only thing of its kind, but it says in very graphic form exactly what the Israelis prefer to have happen in Syria, and they've gotten their wish so far. They don't care so much as long as there's chaos in Syria. And one reason, of course, is that Hezbollah in Lebanon, as part of the government now, is supplied via Iran and others through Syria. As long as there's chaos there, it's very, very difficult to get supplies in there. And as long as the pot keeps boiling, well, as Alain Pincus said, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria. Now, translate that to Iran. Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon. We know that. There's a formal estimate at the end of 2007 on Iran's nuclear program. Now, they had an honest guy running that estimate, and they came to the conclusion, just as Bush and Cheney were screaming that Iran was just about to get a nuclear weapon, like 2 weeks before, okay? In November 2007, an estimate came out, and it said, and I quote, Iran stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003. Okay, so here's the estimate, 2007. They stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and have not resumed work on weapons. Now, that was a collective judgment. It was unanimous, and it was expressed with high confidence. And what did that do? Well, that put the kibosh on Bush and Cheney's plan to attack Iran during the last year of their tenure, 2008. Again, don't take McGovern's word for that. Read, well, don't buy it, but go to the library and read Bush's memoir. He says, instead of, when he was informed that the intelligence community unanimously said Iran had no active nuclear weapons program, you would expect, one might have expected that Bush's reaction would be, really? Wow, man, are you sure? Oh, did you check that? Oh, I'll call the Israelis. Oh, what wonderful news. Wow. Well, no, that wasn't his reaction. His reaction, by his own pen in his memoir, was, this deprived me of the military option. This was an eye-popping estimate for how could I justify an attack on a country that the intelligence community says has no active nuclear weapons program. End quote. Bummer. So right. That's how close we were. Now that brings us to today, and we're very close today. And what we're doing today is serving up a memo to the president, very much like the one we did for Bush before Iraq. We're telling him, look, there's no reason to be egged into a endless struggle in Iran. Iran is not Iraq. It will make the Iraq experience look like a volleyball game between Mount St. Ursula and the Ursuline Academy in the Bronx. I mean, this is a big deal. Please get some good intelligence on this, because you're not getting it now from Bolton or from Pompeo.
Well, it's interesting with Trump because We haven't just seen this with Iran, with him supposedly calling off these attacks at the last minute, but also there was what happened with Venezuela, where it seemed like there was this slow ramp up to hostilities with Venezuela, and that's kind of seemed to dissipate a little bit over the last several weeks. It seems to me like Trump is sort of playing some sort of good cop, bad cop game, where Bolton and Pompeo are actively campaigning for war against Iran and Venezuela and these other countries, and Trump seems to be playing the good cop, where he's kind of holding them back. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we have this dynamic? Is it part of his art of the deal, or do you think that it actually is Trump trying to restrain the neoconservatives?
My view is that it's just a reflection of the chaotic nature of policymaking in the White House. As you said, Bolton and Pompeo are way out ahead, not only on Iran, but on Venezuela. And then they get pulled back. I mean, by all reports, the CIA had real plans for Venezuela, change of government, everything else. And then they're pulled back. It's really hard to know exactly what's going on. The good cop, bad cop is a reasonable interpretation in my view, but I prefer the chaotic one, the fact that there's no real guidelines, there's no real policy process that we used to have the agencies come together and get best views of what's likely to happen if we do A or to B or 3. And so you have this kind of sporadic aggression, almost like last night, or backing off. Now, yesterday, when the president apparently authorized airstrikes on Iran, and by some reports, the aircraft were in the air, and they called them back. Now, that is interesting. That cries out for some intelligent explanation. And he's going to pay a price for this politically, because you have the pundits in the air saying, "Oh, for once, Trump acted presidentially." What? By doing what? By sending a bunch of rockets and Tomahawk missiles into Syria? That's presidential? And so they're going to say, "Oh, this time he had a chance to be presidential. What did he do?" He buckled. He pulled them back.
Right, now, you already see that. I mean, there was at least one headline that was suggesting that Putin had told him to stop it, or put out in the public that the U.S. shouldn't attack Iran. It's sad. It seems like the media, they're always kind of campaigning for war, and they're always hitting Trump from the right and trying to provoke him into actually attacking countries. I mean, even actually when he did bomb Syria, there was a criticism that it wasn't destructive enough. Not enough people got killed, and that he must have been colluding with Putin as to not cause damage. So it seems like these folks in the media just will not be satisfied until Moscow itself is leveled.
My God, that's not an overstatement. It's really strange. This has all happened before. I mentioned 2007, 2008. Also in 2007, Bush and Cheney were not satisfied with one aircraft carrier group in the Persian Gulf. They sent another one. And then they wanted to send another one. And as Cheney put it, we want to send the message. Well, Admiral William Fallon, who was chief of CENTCOM, the Central Command having purview over that area, put the kibosh on the third carrier group. He said, "We don't need it. We don't need it. The Iranians are not threatening us. We don't need it." And that put him in very bad odor with Cheney and Bush. And then he said, and this is really interesting, he said to a friend of mine, Colonel Pat Lang, who also does a lot of analysis. He worked for DIA as the chief Middle East analyst. He told Colonel Lang, he said, "Look," he said, "Pat, we're not going to do Iran on my watch." Now, this is early 2007, all right? So Pat asked him, Pat said, "Ready for okay?" He says, "Well, you mind if I pass that along?" And Fallon just turned around. So that went directly to the Washington Post. The next morning, Admiral Fallon, head of CENTCOM, says, "We're not going to do Iran on my watch," quote, end quote. Whoa, all hell broke loose. A couple months later, Bobby Gates, the defense secretary, was sent out to Tampa to relieve Admiral Fallon. Well, Fallon was saying that I don't care how much you cook the intelligence. I'm not going to get my boys into a war that's not really necessary. And so he was cashiered. It's the only example of that kind. Now, what was really interesting is that Hilary Mann, a very well-respected national security director for Iran and Persian Gulf affairs, former, she warned at the time, and what she said was some Bush advisors secretly wanted an excuse to attack Iran. Quote, "They intend to be as provocative as possible and make the Iranians do something that America would be forced to retaliate for," quote, end quote, she told Newsweek. So, deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say. That's what they're trying to do now. Now, last thing, we sort of tucked this into the end of our thing for, here I'm scooping myself. This may not survive. My colleagues have a very sharp pen and they cut my stuff to pieces sometimes. But when I heard that Tucker Carlson yesterday evening said this, quote, "The very people, in some cases, literally the same people who lured us into the Iraq quagmire 16 years ago are demanding a new war, this one with Iran. The president, to his great credit," says Carlson, "appears to be skeptical of this, very skeptical, period," end quote. Well, I hope it's skepticism. And what we say in this memorandum is we give President Trump evidence that we have personally experienced, showing that the agenda of Mike Pompeo does not always coincide with the agenda of President Trump. And we have a very specific example of that, which we show that when Pompeo was asked to talk to one of our specialists on RussiaGate, he couldn't have been less interested. That was 2 years ago. Had he taken seriously what Bill Binney, a former NSA technical director, told him, then RussiaGate would have sort of petered out 2 years before it did. Now, we know because Pompeo told Binney, the only reason you're here in CIA headquarters is because the president said that if I wanted to know the real story about RussiaGate, I should talk to you. Oh, wow. Bill Binney felt really good about it. So now Bill is a plain-spoken fellow. So Pompeo says, "So what's the deal?" And Bill says, "Well, I don't like to tell you this, but your people are lying to you." What do you mean lying? Pompeo was very surprised. Well, so Bill Binney took them through the whole business about the hacking being a ruse, being a made-up story, which we now, of course, have been vindicated on. And then he said, did you not know this? Now, Pompeo wasn't going to say anything. He says, "Well, Mr. Binney, do you have contacts with the FBI?" And Bill says, "Well, yeah, the last time I had contacts with the FBI, 12 of them were swarming into my house, putting a gun to the head of my wife, putting a gun to my head in the shower, and looting all the computer and other equipment that I had, knowing, and we're talking Bob Mueller here, knowing that we were not the source of the leak to the New York Times. They already knew who it was. So yeah, that's the last time I had contact with the FBI." So then Pompeo says, "Well, do you have good contacts in NSA?" And Bill says, "Of course I do. I know everybody there. I used to be technical director there, but I don't think they're going to talk to me, Mr. Pompeo." And Bill was gracious enough to say, "Hey, man, why don't you ask the FBI and the NSA?" Well, long story short, Pompeo never asked anybody. he preferred not to get involved in this. Now, why is that important? Well, when the president asks you to do something, you're supposed to do it. To do it in good faith. Pompeo just went through the motions. And so what we tell the president here is, look, Pompeo isn't always, in direct sync with you. As a matter of fact, sometimes he doesn't even overlap with you, with his agenda. And his agenda with respect to Iraq is war. And you ought to know that. And here's an example of another instance which mattered greatly. It was consequential. It had to do with RussiaGate. He could have helped you out. The deal could have collapsed 2 years before it did, and he didn't do it. So you ought to be a little cautious about Pompeo. The other thing we tell the president is that you ought to be very cautious about CENTCOM. Now, why do I say that? Well, CENTCOM had a debacle with respect to intelligence analysis. Now, we know that intelligence on the Middle East has always been spotty, and sometimes it's been fixed, right, for political purposes. But 4 years ago, 50 intelligence analysts at CENTCOM complained to the Inspector General of the Pentagon, saying that their commanders were imposing a, quote, false narrative, end quote, on analysis, rewriting things, suppressing things, and trying to make the worst cause appear the better. It's the way that Socrates would have said it. In other words, they're putting a rosy interpretation on what was going on in Syria and to an extent on Iraq. These people were doing their duty, writing up the intelligence, and by the time it got up to the upper echelons, it was being manipulated, and they complained. There were 50 of them. Many of them quit. Now, CENTCOM analysts were joined by intelligence analysts from the DIA, from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which has purview over all this stuff. So CENTCOM has a very, very spotty record. And, all's fair in love and war. Truth is the first casualty of war. So we're suggesting in a kind of sotto voce way, hey, Mr. Trump, yesterday you accepted as Bible truth that drone was over international waters. Well, we hate to tell you this, Mr. President, but our experience with intelligence analysts and particularly military commanders going way back to Vietnam is that you don't always get the truth. Not even the president always gets the truth from these military commanders. So there's another thing. Do I think the drone was shot down over Iranian territory or Iranian claimed territory, as Tehran claims? I don't know. But I do know that we can't just take as Bible what CENTCOM or any other military intelligence outfit says, and that goes in some respects to civilian intelligence outfits also.
So you've alluded to how you guys have kind of disproven certain RussiaGate talking points, and I do want to delve back into that again. But before that, I just would like to get some of your perspective again, because you were the head of the CIA's Soviet Foreign Policy Bureau for a while, and you have a really great perspective on this. Why do you think it is that we have re-entered a Cold War with Russia? And specifically, what happened with the Democratic Party, where they went from, in 2012, joking about Russia being a foe to now, being sort of neo-John Birchers? Was it Libya? Was it Ukraine? Was it Edward Snowden? Was it a combination of those things? Just what's your perspective on that?
That's a really good question, Steve. I'll give you two acronyms. HRC, or Hillary Rodham Clinton, and a new one that I've coined. We used to talk about the military-industrial complex, the MIC, the MIC. Now we have running things, what I call the Mickey Mat. Now, if you got a pencil, your listeners, you might want to take this down, okay? Instead of the military-industrial complex, we have the military-industrial congressional intelligence media academe think tank complex, Mickey Mat. And why did I say media? Well, because Media needs to be in all caps. It's the sine qua non for making this all work. It's the tool of the corporate and the international corporate welfare here. And it's owned by the same corporations that profiteer. I don't say profit, that profiteer on war. I like to cite what I don't often cite the Pope, but this one was not bad when he came to Congress. And, I remember him saying, and I watched it, he said, the main problem is the blood-drenched arms traders. Now, if you watched all these senators and representatives, they all got up, and then they looked inside their coat jacket for the last envelope from Lockheed, the last envelope from Raytheon. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name. But that is the problem. I mean, there are a lot of people that profiteer on war, very important people of Wall Street and corporate world. And the last thing they want is a decent relationship with Russia. Whoa, along comes Donald Trump, and he says, incredibly, I don't see why we can't have a better relationship with Russia. Oh my God, well, we see why we can. We're not going to make as much money producing, selling arms. So that's at the bottom of this, the Mickey Mouse, military, industrial, congressional. Ike wanted to say congressional too, but his brother said, no, that's a little too much. They're limited to the military industrial. But now congressional is right in there. Military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media. And the other part is academia and the think tank complex. It's all there. And so now, how did this change? When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she did Libya. Obama conceded that was a mistake. He shouldn't have listened to her. But, they tricked the Russians and the Chinese on that. They said, look, if you abstain from, if you don't veto the resolution, please just be advised that we're just flying cover over and make sure that nothing bad happens in Libya. So, sure, please, just abstain. Well, one of the things that Putin has been criticized for is how could it be so gullible that, and they did abstain. And of course, then they had some sort of UN umbrella to do the damage and of course, get Gaddafi killed, to which Hillary cackled and saying, we came, we saw, he died. So it all started at that point. And of course, they wanted to do what was good for Israel in Syria. And so, and this is a kind of an interesting story. On the 20th of August, 2012, Obama was given a little slip of paper at the end of a press conference. And Chuck Todd, I think it was Chuck, he said, now, Mr. President, you said earlier today that there were no circumstances under which you would use our military to get involved in Syria. Now, is that really true? Are there absolutely no circumstances? And Obama, looking down at his little note just given to him, says, well, if Syria used or even moved chemical weapons, well, that would change my calculus. Now, why do I mention that? That was August 20th, 2012. Fast forward exactly 1 year. August 21st, 2013, there's a chemical weapons attack against Ghouta, a little town outside of Damascus. John Kerry immediately gets up and he blames the Russians. Actually, blamed the Russians. Blamed the Syrians. He blamed them 35 times in one interview 10 days after the attack. They wanted to go into Syria. And, Obama he said, well, okay, we'll. And finally, Obama said, well, let's let Congress decide. Now, that drove the neocons who were just about to get their war, just about to get U.S. overt Army, Air Force involvement in Syria, that put the kibosh on that. And they were very, very bitter, okay? Now, Kerry kept trying. He went before Congress on the 3rd of September, 2013, and said, we're winning in Syria. And the Syrians have done this out of desperation, and blah, blah, blah. We have to authorize. Now, you have to authorize it because Obama said you have to authorize it, so please do. Now, that day, actually it was the next day, the 4th of September, Obama arrives in St. Petersburg for one of these economic summits, okay? And what does Putin do? He says on that same day as Obama is arriving, Mr. Kerry, он врет, он знает, что врет, это печально. Mr. Kerry, he lies. He knows that he's lying. This is very sad. Whoa, I have never, I've been watching Russian Soviet leaders since about 1962, and never have I seen a Soviet premier or a first secretary or a president accuse a U.S. Secretary of State of lying. But that's what he chose to do. Why? Because number one, the good guys, so to speak, the white hats were not winning in Syria. And number two, Putin knew darn well that the attack attributed to Syria, to the Syrian government by Kerry, without any evidence, by the way, and not even an intelligence assessment, just what they call the new rubric, a government assessment. Now, just to finish this up, we later learned during an interview by the president himself, President Obama, with Jeffrey Goldberg, two things. We learned that during that crucial week at the end of August 2013, he was visited by the head of national intelligence, a fellow named James Clapper, okay? And what did Clapper say? Well, he said, Mr. President, with all due respect to Secretary Kerry, well, let me just put it this way. It was a really good driving boats up the Mekong River, but that doesn't make you a strategic analyst or an intelligence officer. Let me just put it this way, Mr. President. The notion that Bashar al-Assad was responsible for that chemical attack, well, it's not a slam dunk. You get my drift, Mr. President? It's not a slam dunk. Now, for those young folks listening, slam dunk is what George Tenet, previous director of Central Intelligence, told Bush and Cheney on December 21st, 2002, when they had given him a briefing on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And Bush said, "Is that all you got? Oh, God." And Tenet said, "It's a slam dunk. We can make it better. It's a slam dunk." So here's the head of national intelligence telling Obama, right when he's making these decisions, that it's not a slam dunk. John Kerry is doing political stuff, and as Putin said, he's lying. So it's not a slam dunk. Now, what happens? This is what Obama told Goldberg several years later. And Obama said, for once, I didn't follow what he called the Washington playbook. And I'm really, really proud of that. Now, what happened immediately? What happened was Kerry appears in London, like the 6th of September 2013, and says, "We gotta attack. We gotta respond to this. We can't. We put down a red line, and he crossed it. We gotta attack Syria." And then he's asked some questions, and one of them was, "Mr. Kerry, suppose Bashar al-Assad decided to give up his chemical weapons. What then?" And Kerry said, "Oh, come on. He's not going to do that. That's not in the cards. I'm not going to answer that." Well, guess what? He gets on a plane, and Obama calls him in the plane and says, "Oh, John, I forgot to tell you, when I was with Putin earlier this week, he reminded me that we set up this working group to see how we could get rid of all the chemical weapons left over in Syria. And guess what? They're very close to an agreement. Putin told me to listen to the Syrian foreign minister the next day, and sure enough, he announced that they had agreed to destroy all their chemical weapons under UN supervision, and that's going to go ahead. So, John, when you come back, I want to see you, of course, when I have dinner with you, but then I want you to go right back to Geneva and finish up this agreement." Whoa. Here's Kerry till the last minute He was kept out of this because he lies, because he had an agenda. So here's the kind of forces at play here. Kerry and Clinton before him. And then, of course, the big deal in Russia-U.S. relations was the downing of MH17 over Ukraine on the 17th of July, 2014. Again, Kerry gets up on all the Sunday TV shows 3 days after the downing, and he says, the Russians did it. We have telemetry. We know when the plane was shot down. We know where it was shot down. And we know from telemetry who did it. Whoa. Guess what? Kerry has not made that so-called telemetry or any of that other evidence he bragged about available to the inspectors, to the people who are investigating these things. When people ask for it, it's just sort of assumed Kerry said it, and so it's fact. And so there is no resolution as to who shot down that plane, but the United States decided to use this under the leadership of Hillary and her successor Kerry and Victoria Nuland, and they decided to use that as an additional thing against Russia for doing this, and the whole Ukrainian thing that happened back in February of that same year, 2014. And that, of course, needs to be mentioned because never has there been a more transparent coup arranged by the West, the U.S. in the lead, as the coup in Kiev, Ukraine, in February of 2014. There was a fellow, Friedman, who used to head Strat 4. He said that it was the most transparent, the most blatant coup in the history of coups themselves. So in other words, we replaced a Moscow-friendly Yanukovych with a puppet. And why do they say it was so blatant? Well, because 2 weeks before the coup itself, the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, was caught in an open conversation on the telephone with the ambassador there, Jeffrey Pyatt. And what she says is, we've got it all arranged now. Yats is our guy. Yatsenyuk, the prime minister that they put in there. And it's going to happen soon. And so just make sure these other guys are waiting in the wings. And it's all orchestrated. We're going to do it. Now, no one has denied that happened. I mean, that was an openly intercepted message showing that a coup is in the works. Now, Victoria Nuland has admitted that that's what it was, and because she had to apologize. At one point, our ambassador in Kiev says, well, what about the EU? And she uses the F word. She says, F the EU. We got this all arranged, okay? Now, she had to apologize to the EU for her dismissive attitude toward the EU, but there I was right on tape. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that with that coup, in the wake of the long-standing promise by the U.S. not to try to bring NATO any closer to Russia, things changed in a very major way. Here was the U.S. encroaching on Russia's major neighbor, in a country which has and still has Russia's only warm water port, the only port that its Navy can use all year round, in Sevastopol, in Crimea. So that started the ball rolling. Putin decided that he couldn't countenance the notion of NATO taking over Sevastopol base there, and not only naval base, there are airfields all over Crimea. And so there was a plebiscite, and as it was no surprise to anybody, the Crimeans voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia. Now that set the stage. Then Russia could be accused of invading Crimea, which it didn't. Actually, Russia, by previous agreement with Ukraine, had 20,000 troops already stationed there. But that started the downturn. That was February 2014. Then in July 2014, there was the MH17 mess. And the arms dealers were clapping their hands. I'll give you one little, for instance, again. There's a joint French-German company that was building the Common European Battle Tank. Maffei was the name of the German company. I can't remember the French name, French company. But they were dead in the water. I mean, they had all the plans, they had all the permission, everything to build this Common European Battle Tank. But, the threat from Russia remained to be proven, quite demonstrandum. They couldn't be demonstrated. They needed this. And, in this day of high technology, a battle tank is probably a little bit obsolescent. So anyhow, they're dead in the water. What happens after MH17 is shot down? I wish I had smart enough to buy some stock in Maffei, because it zoomed, and now they're building the Common European Battle Tank. So that's a microcosmic example of how the arms makers and the arms dealers are really ruling the roost in these matters.
So again, I'd really like to dig into what you folks at VIPS have helped expose about the RussiaGate narrative and have debunked about it. But could you maybe just first give a little bit of background on the hacking into the DNC server, what we were told about it, and what evidence has now emerged about it?
Sure. People will remember, I hope, that the centerpiece of the charge against Russia interfering with our election was the hacking of the DNC computers and the reported giving of this material to WikiLeaks to publish in order to advance Trump's prospects and hurt Hillary Clinton. It's a really interesting story, as interesting as I've seen. As you'll recall, many of you, when the campaign for president started, Hillary Clinton thought that Trump was very vulnerable on Russia. He was a fellow who said that we should have a more decent relationship with Russia. He could deal with Putin. My God, that was anathema. Anathema to whom? Anathema to the Mickey Mat. Anathema to Wall Street. Anathema to all the people that were giving big bucks to Hillary. And, you can't have people saying this. So she thought the American people would care about that. She was wrong. Her people cared about that. But the American people didn't really resonate with that. But it was prepared. Now, what happened? Here's a little, if people have a pencil or so, they might write down a note. June 12th, 2016, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks announces, we have emails related to Hillary Clinton pending publication. Okay, so that's June 12th. Okay, now, how far from the Democratic National Convention would that be? Well, June 12th, July 25th, I don't know. You got to do the math. It's about 6-7 weeks, I guess. Okay. Well, you can imagine the consternation in Hillary's camp at the notion that if Julian Assange had emails from the DNC, those emails would show, pure and simple, that Hillary stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. That's the case, folks, and that's what those emails do show. Okay, so what was the reaction? Well, I wasn't a bug on the wall, but I can see what happened. You don't have to be a crackerjack analyst to analyze it. What happened was Hillary got her top advisors together and said, my God, what are we going to do? He says, pending publication. So if he publishes this before the convention, what's Bernie going to do? Oh, my God, we got to figure out something to do. And then one of her advisors raised his hand there. I got an idea. What's that? We'll blame it on Russia. Hillary looks, it wasn't Russia. It was WikiLeaks. That's okay. We hate them both. they're both in bad odor. We'll say, let's say Russians hacked in and gave them to WikiLeaks. And Hillary looks around. She says, anybody got any better idea? No. That's what they went with. Okay. Now, how did they do that? Let's go back to June 12th, 2016, the day that Assange announced he had these emails. 2 days later, a firm hired by the DNC called CrowdStrike says, we have evidence that there had been intrusions into the DNC computers, and there's evidence that Russia was involved.
Do you happen to know when they said that hack took place?
Well, they didn't say, but we know when it took place from metadata at the very end of May, 23rd, 24th, 25th. How do we know that? Well, we looked at the metadata. Did CrowdStrike not look at the metadata? Well, if they did, they disguised it. So we're talking, 2 or 3 weeks before Julian announced it. And getting back to the scenario on the 12th, Julian Assange's announcement, the 14th, CrowdStrike, the cyber company that the DNC was paying, says, the Russians did it. And on the next day, the 15th, Guccifer 2.0 arises from the ashes and says, CrowdStrike is right. We did it, and we gave the take to Assange. Now, there's the foundation for the story, that it was the Russians that did it. Now, we don't know who Guccifer is. Somebody knows who Guccifer is, and I can give you his name if you want, but Guccifer 2.0 is an entity, a persona. We don't know if it's a man or a woman. We use non-sexist language referring to Guccifer 2.0. It's an it, okay? And it's very shadowy. And to his embarrassment, Bob Mueller has based indictments on stuff from Guccifer 2.0, which we can prove, that is, Guccifer 2.0, we can prove is a total fraud, based on the metadata that he or she or it has released. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let me just say that Julian Assange, takes a little while. He's really careful. He verifies the information against what he has. And he verified these were real emails from the DNC, and nobody has disputed that. And so he did what he usually does. He arrayed them in a searchable form. And on the 22nd of July, 2016, he released them. Now, there was a furor when they were released. And what were the headlines in the New York Times, Washington Post? Why did Russia do this? Why did Russia hack into the DNC? Not a word, or very few, were about what the content of these emails were.
Right.
And so it was a magnificent diversion. And Hillary's chief PR person, Jennifer Palmieri, has admitted in forums that I have attended that she had instructions during the convention to take her golf cart and visit all the cable and other outlets and make sure that she pushed this story that the Russians hacked into the DNC to hurt Clinton and to help Trump. And she says candidly, it was hard to sell, and we even had problems believing it. But when we got back to Brooklyn, of course, was Hillary's headquarters. Then we started getting visits from intelligence people and from journalists who have really good ties with intelligence people. And they gave us more information about the hacking. And then Obama, the administration, would confirm some of this. Then we were off and running, okay? Whoa. So it got so bad, Steve, that the Wall Street Journal complained. They said, look, the CIA is briefing Washington Post and New York Times. They're neglecting us. Why aren't they come see? So that's how it all started. Now, it took off, and of course, that became the narrative about Russian hacking. And that was just one part of the whole deal, to make sure that they had some defense against the notion that Hillary, when all said and done, had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie, I don't know, Bernie made some really bad tactical mistakes. I was disappointed in the fact that he read the emails. His people read the emails. They didn't have the guts to stand up at the convention.
Well, he kind of shot himself in the foot too, because prior to all of this, there was the controversy over Hillary Clinton's private email server and if that could be hacked, and that was really a huge focal point going into the election. Until Bernie Sanders at one of the debates said that he doesn't care about Hillary Clinton's emails and didn't want to hear about them.
Let me say something that may not be great politics, but I think the Secretary is right. And that is that the American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails.
Thank you. Me too.
So months later, when you have this happen, not only does it distract from that, and destroy that original narrative about Hillary Clinton's server, but it also, Bernie Sanders had painted himself into a corner where he couldn't really make a big deal about these emails showing that the DNC was conspiring against him.
Well, that's why I talked about tactical mistakes. The biggest one was the one you just mentioned. It was the first debate, if I recall correctly. And he says, I don't care about your damn emails. And she smiled, and everybody said, oh, this avuncular, gracious guy, he doesn't care about her emails. Well, Bernie, you're in a tough competition here. You don't dismiss this thing just to appear very gracious and avuncular and grandfatherly and all that kind of stuff. So it was a major mistake, but still, it was so clear from the content of these emails that he had been, really, really put at a very distinct disadvantage by the top four people in the DNC quit on the spot. I mean, what does that tell you?
Right.
But so I would prefer Bernie to put up a little fight at that time. He had lots of delegates and he had lots of ammunition, and instead of that, he had acquiesced the week before, I guess, saying he was going to support Hillary, and so he did. Now, when she won, when she didn't win, okay, well, all hell broke loose because I was in Germany at the time, and my God, the people, the commentators, nobody could even address her losing. And how did they explain it? Well, it couldn't be because people didn't trust Hillary. It couldn't be because she didn't campaign in the right states. It couldn't be because of that email server business. It couldn't be because she was shown to be in bed with Wall Street by some of those leaks. It had to be something else. In Russia was conveniently elected. Okay, now that's the way it worked. They had already prepared the groundwork for that, and so what they got was Russia, and not only before the election but after the election, they used Russia to try to emasculate Trump and prevent him from actually governing, and most important, of course, prevent him from creating a more decent relationship with the Russians. And the Mickey Matt kicks in again because you get a good relationship with Russia. How do you justify spending billions and billions and billions and depriving our own people of the sustenance they need to live a decent life?
So getting back to the server itself, and the analysis that you folks did in regards to the speed, and then also I understand that analysis has kind of become relevant again because of the Roger Stone case. So could you explain, what documents you have come across in the Roger Stone case, and then also tie this back into your previous analysis about the download speeds?
Well, the big picture is the new evidence that the Department of Justice has come forth with in pretrial negotiations relating to Roger Stone being accused of various and sundry. The main premise, as usual, if you're going to have a syllogism, you have to have a main premise. Main premise is that the Russians hacked into the DNC and gave those emails to WikiLeaks. Now, Bill Binney, who was a former technical director at NSA, and who's one of our VIPs, our veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, and who's been trying to spread some truth around against all odds, was asked by Roger Stone's defense, well, hey, Benny, you've been saying that there's nothing to this legend about Russian hacking. Come talk to us. Well, they didn't come. He's got no legs, actually. They talked on the phone, and they said, this is amazing, because if you can prove, Benny, that there was no Russian hacking, well, the whole case falls apart. A lot of stuff falls apart. Well, Benny gave him the information. He did an affidavit. They sent it forward to the Justice Department saying, the evidence that James Comey, the head of the FBI, has adduced to say that the Russians hacked at the DNC comes from CrowdStrike, the DNC hired cybersecurity firm of dubious reputation, by the way. Now, we would like to see the report that CrowdStrike gave to James Comey, because it's odd right off the bat that James Comey didn't seize those computers. After all, John McCain and others were crowing that this was an active war on the part of Russia, active war. And James Comey didn't immediately send his technicians in to inspect those and didn't see it. Well, that's really hard to explain. Well, he didn't. What he said was CrowdStrike was a, quote, high-class entity, end quote, and that he decided to rely on their forensics. So the affidavit and the defense said, okay, let's see the CrowdStrike report. Guess what? Department of Justice comes back and says, we can't give it to you because there is no CrowdStrike report. There never has been one. There were a couple, three drafts that were shown to various and sundry, but there was no final report. So we can't give it to you. Whoa. Now, what CrowdStrike did come up with was a heavily redacted report, and there was just a draft that was never concluded. So what does that mean? Well, that means that James Comey, as head of the FBI, when this alert came out that the Russians had hacked into the DNC, number one, refused to look at the DNC computers, and number two, took the word of a very suspect, a cyber firm of very ill repute, and it took their word without a final report. Comey didn't demand a final report. He just took what CrowdStrike said. Yep, with the Russians. So, I mean, you don't have to be an inspector general to see that the whole thing falls apart if Comey does not even have a report.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. So as I understood it, CrowdStrike provided some kind of imaging or file that showed what was on their server rather than the server itself. So is there a reason why that would not be sufficient?
Well, Comey was asked about this in congressional testimony. He was said, now, Mr. Comey, isn't it always good to have physical access to these computers? And Comey said, oh, yes, you're right about that. That best practice dictates that you have physical contact. But my folks tell me that they talked to CrowdStrike and they answered all their questions. So Senator Barr, head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, says, well, yeah, but this is a counterintelligence investigation. Don't you need the content? And Comey sort of squirms a little, and he says, well, my people say they got everything they need from CrowdStrike. Well, now we know there's not even been a final CrowdStrike report. There were other things that Comey squirmed about. They asked him why he didn't seize the computers. This is Will Hurd from Texas before the House Intelligence Committee. He says, so when did you inspect those computers at the DNC? And Comey said, well, sir, actually, we didn't. We were never given access. Never given access. Give me a break.
Director Comey, let me talk about forensics for just a minute, because the FBI has the expertise there. And I know there's tremendous investigative value when the FBI is actually able to conduct their own forensics review on devices that have suffered cyber intrusions and attacks. I believe there's some confusion, though, or at least some conflicting reporting as to whether the FBI requested access to the DNC's services, the Democratic Congressional Committee servers, and John Podesta's personal devices. Did the FBI request access to those devices to perform forensics on?
Yes, we did.
And would that access have provided intelligence or information helpful to your investigation and possibly to the findings included in the intelligence community assessments?
Our forensics folks would always prefer to get access to the original device or server that's involved. So it's the best evidence.
Were you given access to do the forensics on those servers?
We were not. We were a highly respected private company, eventually got access and shared with us what they saw there.
But is that typically the way the FBI would prefer to do the forensics, or would your forensics unit rather feel the servers and do the forensics themselves?
We'd always prefer to have access hands-on ourselves, if that's possible.
Do you know why you were denied access to those servers?
I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure.
Was there one request or multiple requests?
Multiple requests at different levels, and ultimately what was agreed to is the private company would share with us what they saw.
The head of the FBI, for God's sake. What did he need? A little piece of paper, a letter, or maybe a warrant. I mean, he could have easily gotten access. For some reason, Comey was in on some sort of secret, which said, it's really better to depend on CrowdStrike for this information. And now CrowdStrike, not for the first time, has been proven to be very, very shadowy outfit. So, yeah.
And just, I'm sorry, just again, for clarification, who exactly is CrowdStrike, and do you know how long they've had a relationship with the DNC for?
It's run by a fellow named Alperovich, who's a member of the Atlantic Council and other very anti-Russian outfits. They worked on things having to do with Ukraine artillery and tank fire, and came up with conclusions that were disproven and really gave them a shady reputation. But that was before the DNC decided to hire them. Their top brass includes one person who worked for Mueller as a top cyber official. Henry is his name, Sean Henry. And then there's another fellow who came from the high echelons of the FBI. So it's kind of this incestuous relationship where you go out in the private sector, you set up these cyber firms, and then you're still pretty much connected at the hip with your former employer. And Comey, of course, knew all that. You're supposed to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The appearance was there, and so was the sustenance. What's interesting now is that the article that I wrote 3 days ago, and others since, and two actually in a reportorial fashion before, have all been out there for 5-6 days now, and the mainstream media has completely ignored them. So we're just wondering how long are they going to be able to do that, and of course, what's coming into view now are the various investigations. Not only the ones in Congress, but the one that's being run by Bill Barr, the Attorney General, who has employed this fellow in Connecticut, Durham, to investigate the origins of the RussiaGate story. And it's going to probably take a while, but he will have an interesting story to tell. The other thing is that we have been expecting a report from the DOJ, that's Department of Justice Inspector General, this month in June. And that will be a newsworthy item as well. It was, after all, the Inspector General of the Justice Department, which has purview of the FBI, of course, that revealed this text exchange between the deputy head of counterintelligence in the FBI, Peter Strzok, and his paramour, Lisa Page, who worked directly for Deputy Director McCabe. Okay, so that text exchange has been available, hold on to your hat now, since December 2017. Now, what does it say? Well, among other things, it says, Strzok to Page, I don't know if I want to get involved in the Mueller investigation because I've been looking at it for 7 months and there's no there. Whoa. This is right out of the mouth of the fellow, not only who's been looking into the investigation about Russian hacking, but also the fellow who decided to let Hillary off very easily by telling his boss, Comey, not to charge her with indictable offenses, but just saying she was recklessly careless, okay? So this Strzok Page conversation was revealed because of the Mueller inquiry and because the IG of the Justice Department actually did his job. And my wonderment comes of the fact that when I speak around the country about this, even to progressive audiences, very few. One forum, there were 3 out of 150 that had even heard that there was material showing Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were conniving to make sure that Hillary would win and that Trump would lose, and that at one point Strzok had said, as I said before, that with respect to evidence of the Russian collusion with Trump, there was, quote, no there, end quote. Now, that's been available for years now. Nobody has picked up on it, and that's another example of the mainstream media just pursuing the interests of Mickey Matt and not the interests of the American people.
So, again, I do just want to touch on the analysis that you folks did, I believe it was about 2 years ago, regarding the rate of transfer for the emails. Could you maybe just remind us again what that analysis was? Sure. And why you came to that conclusion?
Bill Binney knew, because he created these collection mechanisms, that NSA was collecting everything on everybody. Well, that meant if the Russians hacked into the DNC, ipso facto, NSA would have those messages, or would have that traffic, would have that those communications. Okay, well, that was hard to argue because it's sort of the lack of evidence. It's sort of like Rumsfeld's dictum. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, Okay, so you can't make a really airtight case on that. So we looked very carefully at the evidence that came in the metadata of one of Guccifer 2.0's revelations of a so-called Russian intrusion dated July 5, 2016. That was represented to have been a Russian intrusion, and some of the content of emails was displayed, but curiously enough, it was not very damning of anything. It was just, just a kind of chit-chat. Okay, so July 5th. Well, we looked at the metadata for the July 5th event, and we found out that it was copied onto a thumb drive or some other external storage device. How do we know that? Well, we saw the exchange rate. We saw how the information was transferred from a computer, and it could not have been a hack over the internet, because we knew the capacity of the internet on July 5th, 2016, and the capacity of the internet at that time was 1/3 of the speed with which these emails were downloaded. Matter of fact, the speed with which they were downloaded happened to be precisely the same speed that a thumb drive could tolerate, the most advanced thumb drive in those days. That means physical access to the computer or server, and it was copied at a speed that was 3 times the capacity of the internet and exactly the same capacity as a thumb drive.
Well, the irony about the whole conspiracy theorist label is that RussiaGate itself is a conspiracy theory. It's this accusation that, through various means, through the hacking, through the Facebook trolls, through, I guess, Natalia Velenskaya meeting at Trump Tower, that all of these different things, point to some scheme between Putin and Trump, or for Putin to have some kind of Manchurian candidate in the White House. Despite the fact that Trump is selling weapons to Ukraine, despite the fact that he bombed Syria, despite the fact that he, is being aggressive towards Venezuela and Iran, and all of his policy. When I had Noam Chomsky on the show, that was his main point: is what was the quid pro quo? Everything that Trump is doing is actually against Russia. So how have they benefited in any way from this? So it is funny, the conspiracy theorist label, because the corporate media is the one pushing the conspiracy theory in this case. And I think it can be very damaging and detrimental, and we've seen that especially with Julian Assange and him being arrested now a couple months ago. And I think that, when you look at Julian Assange and the arc of his journalistic career, he was really well regarded a few years ago. I remember him showing up on corporate media shows like Real Time with Bill Maher. He was celebrated up until the 2016 election. And now following that, they're able to go into the Ecuadorian embassy, arrest him, and prosecute him on things that he did, information that he published back in 2010.
Well, I have to, full disclosure here. Julian is a close friend of mine. He's a much admired friend of mine. And I'm a strong supporter of Julian for being the journalist and the publisher that he has been. I make no bones about that. I was with Julian. I've visited him several times in the embassy there in Ecuador. I was with him after I participated in one of those Oxford Forum debates there. I was in Britain and came down and, as usual, made arrangements to have dinner with him. And he said, "No, Ray, it's 3 days before the election, and I'm kind of busy. We won't be able to chat like we usually. But yeah, hey, come and bring some food. Yeah, we'll talk." Now, when I came in, this is 3 days before the election, right? So I come into the embassy there, and Julian is looking not only pale and sort of dehydrated, but just what the Germans say, erschöpft, just completely, really, really spent. Okay, so I said, "Well, you've been doing it right up to the end." He says, "Yeah, we just had John Pilger just did an interview with me, and it was a final thing about the emails and everything else, and good news, so we got it out, but bad news, nobody would take it except RT." He said, we gave it to BBC, we gave it to Sky News, we gave it Channel 4. We almost said we'd pay them to run it, but they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole or a 12-foot check. Well, anyhow, we end up with this a really good interview by Pilger of Assange 3 days before the election, and it's out there. RT is not the best place for it, obviously, but it's out there. Okay, so we had a little talk, and he was quoting the Germans. The Germans had a way of describing the election, the U.S. elections. It was eine Wahl zwischen Pest und Cholera. Okay, a choice between plague and cholera. And that's what Julian was thinking. So. That's why I was so glad to be able to support Jill Stein and vote for her. Anyhow, Julian wasn't in the business of trying to turn an election. He was in the business of taking documentary evidence leaked to him by somebody in the DNC on a thumb drive, who got on a plane and this is the way we can reconstruct it, and got it either to Julian or one of his lieutenants, and there it was. Now, I should mention that after all our research on the metadata and all those other things, some of our forensic investigators found that before WikiLeaks published these documents, they had been saved in a FAT, a FAT format. What does that mean? That means thumb drive, okay? There is no internet connection with the FAT format. It shows that these things had previously been saved to a thumb drive. So FAT, look it up. So anyhow, what I have to say about Julian is that he was spent because he had done his work, and the reason they hate him, well, there are lots of reasons. Most people don't remember that when Ed Snowden came out to Hong Kong and revealed all these infringements on our liberties under the Fourth Amendment, the NSA dragnet surveillance, he was fully expecting to be wrapped up and by the CIA station right down the road, and that would be the end of his freedom, maybe the end of his life. Well, guess who got him out of there? Julian Assange. How did he do that? Well, he called in all his chips from all his contacts in that part of the world. He sent Sarah Harrison, his chief lieutenant, into Hong Kong, and people kind of know now exactly how they did this against the dragnet by America, by the Hong Kong police, the Chinese police. They got him on that plane. He was going to go to Latin America. They took his passport while he was in flight, so he ended up in Russia. That's how he ended up in Russia. So, okay, that's a big deal as far as the U.S. intelligence community is concerned. That's a big deal about all those who are doing war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so that's one strike against it. But what most people don't know is that the straw that broke the camel's back was this. Julian gets leaks. That's why they call it WikiLeaks, okay? He doesn't hack into things. His lieutenants don't hack into things, normally speaking. They get leaks. They have secure ways of allowing people to give them leaks. Now, what happened? When John Brennan was head of the CIA, he established a completely new directorate, an engineering directorate. In my day, there were 3 directorates: analysis, clandestine work, and administration. Now there are 4, okay? Oh, also science and technology. Anyhow, he added a whole, that means thousands and thousands of people. And where did he get them? Well, he got a lot of people from NSA and other people with technical capabilities to do cyber warfare, to develop cyber tools. Now, someone in the CIA thought this wasn't quite right, that this is going a little bit too far. It wasn't quite right to have a tool that could make a car go 110 miles an hour, crash and kill the occupant. It wasn't quite right to have a tool that you thought your TV was off, but it was monitoring everything in your bedroom. And it wasn't quite right to have what is called Marble Framework. Now, what was that tool? Well, that tool was described by Assange as having been used in 2016, and its job was to, quote, obfuscate, end quote. Now, that's, CIA uses big words sometimes, and obfuscate meant to hack into a server or a computer system, obfuscate, that is, make unclear who hacked in, and leave little telltale signs, imputing the intrusion to somebody else. Now, we know it was used in 2016, and we also know from the report that was done, from the WikiLeaks documents, and no one has disputed their authenticity, that it was designed to work in 5 languages, okay? Chinese, Korean, Persian, Arabic, and Russian, Cyrillic. Now, I pause here to have a sort of a full disclosure. What Bill Binney and I have been talking about has been based on science, on the scientific method, on the principles of physics, like the capacity of the internet on a given date, okay? What I'm about to say now is speculation. We can't prove it, But we can say that the CIA had the wherewithal, the probable motive, and the occasion to hack into whatever computer, disguise who it was that hacked in, and leave telltale signs like breadcrumbs, like Cyrillic, like Russian formats and so forth, to make so the Russians hacked in. So what am I saying now? I'm saying that there were negotiations between a lawyer for Assange and a lawyer from the Justice Department doing illegal work for the CIA. And they occurred in February and March of 2017. And what Julian said was, look, I want some safe passage, a degree of safe passage. And in return for that, I will agree to redact some of the more explosive information, like names of your agents. And I'm willing to tell you, I'm willing to produce technical evidence showing who didn't hack in to the Democratic National Committee. Whoa. Well, that seemed like a pretty good deal, except guess what happened? James Comey, the head of the FBI still in those days, learned of this, and he put the kibosh on the whole thing, okay? And this was the mid part of March 2017. He said, stop it. We don't want to do a deal with Assange. And of course, the real reason was Comey was the last guy that wanted to have technical evidence of who didn't to the DNC. He wedded to the notion through CrowdStrike, of course, that it was the Russians. Okay, so that's really interesting. So that fell apart, and days later, namely on the 31st of March, Julian Assange released this incredible story. Now, the interesting thing is that when that was released, the New York Times ignored it. Now, two previous releases, the one about taking over a car, and then the one about monitoring through a TV, the New York Times is happy to produce that. But on this one, they went, as is their wont these days, back to the government, saying, "Oh my God, should we publish this?" And said, no, don't publish that. So they never have published it. Unfortunately, or fortunately for our purposes, a woman, Ellen Nakashima from the Washington Post, to her credit, was on the ball that day, and she did publish before she got the memo, so to speak, right? Okay, and the headline speaks volumes. Disclosure reveals CIA computer hacking, whatever it was. So she got it out there, so it's out, but the New York Times hasn't touched it. Now, let me just finish up here on this line of questioning, so to speak, and that is this. So 31st of March. Well, on the 13th of April, CIA Director Mike Pompeo gets up before a think tank in Washington, and he says, Julian Assange and his compatriots are demons. Now, I've always had trouble believing in demons, but apparently Pompeo does not. He went on to say, WikiLeaks is a non-state hostile intelligence agency. Whoa, a non-state hostile intelligence agency. Okay, and it was in that month that they leaned all over the Ecuadorians to cut Assange off from the internet. And that was the beginning of what's ended up now in getting Ecuador to throw him out to the tender mercies of Britain and charging Assange with all manner of espionage. Can you believe it? For being a journalist and a publisher. And so he's in a max security jail, prison in London, and he won't have hearings about his extradition until about February of next year. I think this is a travesty of justice. I think that there's great danger here that this will set a precedent that anybody that's a journalist or a publisher that the United States doesn't like, no matter where he is, no matter what nationality he is, the United States feels free to pluck and put in prison for the rest of their life. Hopefully that won't happen in Julia's case, but that's what they want.
We've also seen with this RussiaGate narrative that it's not just against Trump, and it's not just, against the National Rifle Association or people on the right. It's also been used against people on the left. There's been accusations that in 2016 the Russian trolls were also backing Bernie Sanders, that they were supporting Black Lives Matter protests or trying to get people to turn out for them. And we especially saw that with Jill Stein and the way that she was villainized for attending the RT dinner in 2015. We're seeing that now again with Tulsi Gabbard. She previously has been called an Assad apologist because she met with Assad. And even though John Kerry and Nancy Pelosi have met with Assad in the past, I guess that doesn't count. But she also recently has been attacked on the Russia line. There was a report that came out on the day that she announced her candidacy that Russia was going to be backing her campaign. That report by NBC was partially reinforced by a company called New Knowledge, who a couple months earlier was exposed for creating fictitious Russian troll accounts in the Alabama Senate race to make it look as though Russia was interfering in the race, even though they really weren't. And then more recently, there were some other hit pieces. There was one saying that people who are supporters of Russia were donating to her campaign. So she's also been a victim of this too. So I don't know if maybe you just have any thoughts on what we're going to see in the 2020 race.
Well, I have listened to and read what Tulsi Gabbard has said. It's a very unusual situation because I find myself agreeing with all the things she said. I find myself amazed that she has the courage to say them. I think that she's got a good chance, and I think that's what worries Mickey Matt, the military-industrial intelligence complex. And, she's an incredibly intelligent person with guts that is very uncommon on Capitol Hill. So she will be vilified. And my notion is that there's got to be some way to expose the vilifiers. I mean, if they aren't totally discredited by what they did on RussiaGate, and chances are they won't be discredited because who is around to discredit them? It's just like the weapons of mass destruction. People kept their jobs and lived to do another weapons of mass destruction. So
the people who got fired were people like Phil Donahue who exposed the lie.
That's exactly right. So it's going to take people who are tuned to the internet. And, people of my generation need to be reassured by their grandchildren. Look, you can't break your computer. You can't break it. Just don't be so timid. Just do it. It's real easy. And if they know where to look, and, my son who runs my website always gets really upset if I don't mention RayMcGovern.com. Okay, that's my website, RayMcGovern.com. If you don't get it, you don't get it. So that's one source. All kidding aside. And, of course, consortiumnews.com, the website that Bob Perry established 20 years ago, is a really good website. So if people know where to look, and I will say this, that item that I wrote on the DOJ documents showing that CrowdStrike never did a final report, I'd really encourage people to go to either my website or to consortiumnews.com. It's on both. And look at the comments. Look at the comments. I think there are 200 comments under there. They're all, not all, but 90% of them are very substantive. I always learn a lot from reading the comments because really, really smart people comment there. It's unique in that respect, consortiumnews.com. So if people know where to look, and don't think they're getting news when they turn on their TV and put their feet up at the end of a long day, then there's some hope. But short of that, it's going to be a real tough slog for people like Tulsi to have a fair hearing. She's got some things going for her. She's a veteran. She is extremely attractive. And she's as smart as they come. So, I guess this is by way of endorsing Tulsi Gabbard. She would be certainly my candidate if I were in the business of recommending candidates. which I'm not. We people who have taken on a journalism role should not do that. But for your purposes, that's how I feel about Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, Ray McGovern, thank you very much for being back on Primo Nutmeg. It's always great to get your perspective on all these different issues. Again, I hope that folks do go to raymcgovern.com and consortiumnews.com. And you're also on Twitter, so I hope that people follow you at Ray McGovern. And I hope that you can be back on the show at some point in the future.
Thanks, Steve.